morning for the Innovation with the Innovators webinar. This one-hour session will feature 4 of HP's top technology pioneers leading the vision for the organization in areas such as security, cloud, mobility, and big data. My name is Jason Kennedy. I'm one of the directors for Vivid Worldwide, the independent worldwide HP software community, and I'll be your host for the next hour. First, some housekeeping. Today's live session is being recorded and is intended for all Vivid members. If you would like to see this recording, it will be on the British Columbia chapter page of the Vivid website, and we'll talk about that at the end of the session. And it'll be available for all Vivid members. Vivid membership is free. Before we start, I'd like to briefly explain our format for today so that you can participate and get the most value from this session. After some brief introductions, I'll provide the panel with an introductory question. They'll each have an opportunity to answer and then open up for a discussion amongst themselves and involve questions from the audience. If you have a question for the innovators, please type it into the webinar questions panel, and I'll share the questions with our panel in the order received. If your question is for a specific speaker, please preface your question with their name. Here's a picture of the GoToWebinar control panel that usually appears in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If it's been minimized, there should be an orange arrow that will bring it back out. To submit a question, make sure that the questions pane is expanded, and then type in your question and click on Send. It'll pop up for me, and I will be able to address that question to the innovators. So, without further ado, joining us today from HP are Suki Gill, HP's Chief Technologist, EMEA, Business Transformation and Innovation Guru. Suki is responsible for technical direction, innovation, and leading the senior client-facing technical leaders. Suki is a former Chief Technologist in defense and public sectors and has vast technology leadership experience in both private and public sectors. Suki also established the HP Innovation Council. We also have Ed Kettler, Chief Technologist for Sustainability and U.S. Public Sector at HP. Ed has an extensive public sector experience as a CTO with many accolades to his credit and holds patents in video game technology. Stephen Poland, the Global Leader, Digital Media and Communications for HP, is joining us this morning. Stephen leads HP's Digital Media Center of Excellence, along with the development of cloud-based service offerings to support the creation, management, and distribution of media for the media and entertainment industry. He brings more than 20 years of experience in the media and entertainment industry to HP. And our final panelist is Brian McGlynn, the Vice President at Autonomy. Brian has over 12 years of experience helping organizations unlock value and manage risk in large sets of unstructured data. He has been involved with big data before it was called big data. Brian has over 10 years of experience with big data projects in all sectors. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you very much for joining the Vivid Worldwide community today to share your insights.
Thank you. Hi, guys.
Excellent. So the question I'll start everybody off with is, given your experience, please share with us the top 3 game-changing business technology impacts that you see coming at the technology leadership from around the world in the next 12 to 24 months. What are these disruptive technologies, and how do we integrate them into the workplace?
Okay, so this is Suki Gill. I can start first. So there are so many disruptors, and picking the top 3 can be quite a challenge, but I'm going to have a go here. So today, as the enterprise is struggling around existing legacy applications and keeping the lights on, they're trying to innovate. And one of the things that is driving significant desire to innovate and an impetus to innovate is actually the end users themselves are bringing in their own devices. Consumerization is at the heart of this trend. Typically, people have better computer at home than they have at work nowadays. And so bringing those devices, wanting access to certain services, is one of the key trends. And this is not just a device play. This is the fact that they they live and learn outside of the work environment using a whole different set of capabilities. We call this the system of engagement. So they work in a model of engaging with other people through social media sites, through Facebook, through Foursquare, etc. And that experience of how they engage with social media sites through their consumer devices is a completely different experience to the one they have when they come to work. In fact, you know, I've heard quotes like, "Why is it I'm so powerful at home, but I'm so lame at work?" Right? So we think that's one of the key trends where the enterprise has to accommodate this huge change that's going on in the consumer world. I'm not proposing here that there is a Facebook for the enterprise or a Twitter for the enterprise. I actually think the enterprise has lagged behind, and consumer will continue to innovate, but we'll actually see an adaptation and an adopting of certain capabilities. The key issue here will be data. When is the data secure? When does it live inside the firewall, outside the firewall? So that's one key trend. The other trend that I feel is key is cloud. Yeah, sorry guys, you won't be surprised to hear it. It gets billing here as number 2. Now the cloud, though, is not a box. It's not an infrastructure you can buy. It's something much more broad when I think about a cloud as a game changer. It's a different delivery model for services. It's how you can take some of your core services and make them available as business services that others can consume. And it's how you will consume services that currently you build or buy or ask somebody to provide you, but in future you will just consume on a pay-per-use basis. And core to all of that will be how you manage what you promote as your services, what you consume as external services, and how you manage all of that within an enterprise. Cloud, by the way, is at the heart of the whole consumer revolution. Is just an assumption that anything you have in consumer world is delivered as a cloud service. The last one is real-time predictive analytics. So this goes beyond the classic data warehouse of 10, 15 years ago, where Walmart decided to put the nappies next to the beer because the analysis showed that people who came in on a Friday buying beer were likely to have to buy nappies or diapers, sorry guys, as well. It goes beyond the sort of 7-Eleven. We don't have enough floor space in the shop, so we need to analyze external data like weather patterns. So if it's likely to rain, we'll put the umbrellas in the shop. This is something that's a step further again. This is around real-time predictive analytics around what people are likely to do. And in all of this world, there is a need to understand somebody's personal preferences and what they're likely to be interested in to stop them being swamped by, if I just pick an advertising line of discussion here, and that's not the only discussion, by the way. I think there is too much focus on just advertising revenue around some of this. But if you pick advertising as an example, then as I go into a mall, predictive analytics could tie together my location together with my personal preferences and what's available from an ecosystem of suppliers in the mall, and actually make offers to me in line with what I desire. I don't particularly like doing shopping in malls, but when I go, I want to be in there quickly and out. So
you want to go buy instead of shop.
Exactly. So for me, this would be a great experience. I understand, though, there are people who like to get lost in a mall and go discover things. They might not like this, right? So it's not for everybody, but it should be an opt-in, opt-out. So I think those three are the key trends that I think are making a difference.
Yeah, and I can put actually, this is Steve Payline, I can actually put an industry spin on what Suki's presented. From a sort of a consumer experience of home versus work, one of the trends we're finding in entertainment is people coming into the workplace, the sort of a next generation of employees coming into the workplace are expecting the kinds of interfaces they have with social media and collaboration around with friends like their Facebook experience. And when they get to a workplace, they have kind of traditional email, traditional voicemail, and in a lot of companies, very little ability to sort of interact with other employees in a way they're now being accustomed to. So they're really driving the trends within companies to look at different ways of communicating around productions, projects, and collaboration around those things. I think cloud is as well, I'll mention, because with the digitization of content over the last 10 years and the sort of proliferation of data around that content, where you've got essentially ever-expanding amounts of content being generated, as well as increased resolution, increased numbers of versions for languages around the world that are going day and date with a movie release. The data surrounding that is exploding. So entertainment companies are now looking for alternative methods to store that content somewhere outside of their own four walls, just because of the logistics and the power and space requirements to house it. And then from an analytics perspective, entertainment companies are really, you can't just put a movie out there and not know how it works or how well it's being received by the end user. So they're relying now a lot more on analytics and social media to drive not only their content, but really how they're delivering that content to their consumers. The bigger disruption in the entertainment industry has been around the monetization of content. Traditionally, you released a movie theatrically. 6 weeks later, it was released on pay-per-view. Then it went to DVD and VOD, and then eventually to the cable and TV windows. Well, all that has collapsed. The consumer product, the DVD and Blu-ray discs, are falling rapidly, and people are expecting that content should be much less expensive than they're used to paying. So entertainment companies, both on the creation and the distribution side, are really struggling with what is the sort of model around content monetization, and how are they going to derive the same kind of revenue that they have in the past in these new forms of content.
Certainly, a couple things I look at. One of the summarize all the various pieces was Brian McGlynn here with autonomy, part of HP. Probably to sum up, a lot of changes, a lot of things that Suki and Steve had talked about. I'd say really to preface this, the biggest shift we've seen has been the shift from fundamentally our ability and our needs to work with 1950s computers for humans to work in the computer's world, putting in forms, putting in information, checking boxes. Really the card catalog approach of looking for a book. Well, I have to look for a subject field. I have to look for another particular field. We've been trained since the advent of the computer to work in its language. Even Google today, you go in and how many cryptic terms, just to show my age, the Boolean terms and others that I put in there to try to find what I need. Fundamentally, we've been working with that, and what's shifted, certainly what we're working on autonomy, and what we're really seeing is that shift to deal with human information. So certainly what we're doing, what others are doing as well, is how do we deal with human-friendly data? It poses a whole new set of challenges and a whole new set of rewards as well. Looking at documents, looking at unstructured data, which comprises over 85% of the content in an enterprise. Some enterprises even more, if you think about it. Looking at particularly how that would impact monetization of content, how that would impact analytics. That would impact pretty much anything, being able to understand what people do, as opposed to what people in a parameterized computer setting would have to do. So the key pieces we see around that, as an illustrative example, take, for example, looking at a penguin. I could see a document with 100 documents with penguin in it. Well, is it Pittsburgh penguins? Is it a black and white bird from Antarctica? Is it a particular animal that likes to swim in black and white? All different particular areas that would deal with the penguin, different contexts, in many cases not even mentioned. So we apply that to social media. Say, man, that was killer. My experience there was killer. Or went to the hospital, those guys are killers. We're very careful about a lot of areas. Certainly we deal with sarcasm, we deal with human interaction, human data. It comes with a very specific way to deal with that. Now, being able to crack the code, so to speak, and look at what somebody means, so when I search for, hey, I'd like to find about penguins, well, it might be in Pittsburgh, possibly the hockey team, but it may not be. Maybe I'm looking at an aquarium or a museum at that point. Being able to understand that context is very important. And then we put that in other paradigms as well with the shift to mobile. What's astonishing is the amount of devices that are being sold with mobile, the amount of power that's out there inside of mobile devices as well. And certainly the research about having even more miniaturization, even tapping into human-generated electricity in this case, being able to power some very small devices, certainly things that would come out of our lab for power consumption, changes the whole game completely along those lines. One example is a shift to augmented reality. I see that as a major trend coming forward. The ability, once again in the human world, for a computer to understand that I'm looking at the Royal Ontario Museum, or I'm looking at Parliament in England or Parliament in Victoria. All different areas that are very key. But fundamentally understanding these particular items opens up a whole wealth of possibilities, from personalized shopping, personalized tourism, personalized content, basically making simplicity for users trying to wade through what could be 30 zettabytes of content in the next few years with what's outside of the internet.
This is Ed Keller. One of the things that's driving all that, though, in driving will be the economy of scarcity, I think, is the digital haves and the have-nots, but also with, we're rapidly growing the brick economies and their demands on energy and stuff is going to reshape the way we do things, because we won't have, the demand growth curve is going to keep going up for energy and utilities, and if we're not, focusing on using technology to improve our efficiency in things, we'll get buried in our own data, but also the cost of energy is going to go up. So what I see that, we're going to look at different, looking out probably 5, 10 years, if we don't use technology and take advantage of the mobility, the data to find where these resources are, use them more effectively and efficiently, we're going to have some significant challenges with keeping up our standards of living and dealing with the growth. If you look at the price of steel during the Olympics in China, the run up to that, you think you were in a gold rush era. You couldn't buy steel there. You couldn't find a construction crane. Why? You were either in Abu Dhabi or Dubai or in Beijing. So it's optimization, I think, will be one of the key uses of all this data, is figuring out what we need, when we need it, and be effectively using that data to get by. But, it's going to be a completely different landscape. People my age are digital immigrants. We came into this in college when computers were starting to come out. My daughter doesn't have a landline. If I want to get her, I don't call her on the phone, I text her, because she's instantly wired to respond to the ping on her iPhone. But it's my son doesn't have a landline either, and so it's just they're completely different animals, and they take the technology completely differently than the way I'd approach it, because they grew up with a flashing 1200 on the VCR and asked what that was, and it's now it's what's a cassette, what's a tape, what is that? And it's just they've gone through 3 evolutions of technology, and how fast can we absorb all this change? So there's going to be a lot of the growth of digital, the edge devices, the sensors that we're having come out. It's just going to be a completely different world, probably in 10 or 12 years. We can't even imagine it today. Good questions?
Well, we don't have any questions from our audience yet, but I have 1 or 2, gentlemen, if you don't mind.
Okay.
You're talking about optimization of data use and increasing costs of energy use. And Ed and Brian, you were talking about the amount of unstructured data and the need to understand the context. How does this affect the traditional data center, gentlemen? Is that going to be a dinosaur? And obviously, this leads into the whole cloud discussion, but I don't think, at least my personal feeling is that data centers, for the most part, aren't going to go away, but am I deceiving myself?
Well, they can't really go away, but they won't look like the brick and mortar ones we've had for years. You're seeing, and part of that was, if you think back when in the 70s when mainframes were king, is that was the crown jewels of the corporation. You had to build your temple to accounting to house this thing securely because it was a big capital investment. That same compute today is you wear it on your hip. And we used to optimize the heck out of all our code and stuff just to get the most efficiency out of that machine. So now with the servers and stuff, the size they are, their power, we engineer them each generation to be more powerful but less power hungry, and so you're seeing the densities and stuff go up. So things like the HP EcoPod, which is kind of shipping container based. We also have Critical Facility Services has what is sometimes called the butterfly design, where there's a central core with 4 wing data centers. But that's designed to be prefabricated, hauled on site, and have the whole data center stood up in 3 to 6 months, depending on how much site prep you have to do. And an EcoPod can be delivered in 12 weeks from order anywhere in the world. So it's the shape of data centers. We were talking to a Canadian government official last night and talking about what's the data center look like. I said, well, do you have closed military bases with hangars on them? He goes, of course I do. I said, well, how many of these pods do you think you could fit inside that old hangar? And he's looking, going like, because he doesn't want to have to build 4 new data centers. He's got plenty of empty aircraft hangars that he can put the pods in. And so he's got power and he's got security on base. So he's like, that's a different way of looking at it. In Microsoft's Chicago data center, what is it? It's a big warehouse-type building that's got pods stacked too high in it. And so, I don't think you'll see the palaces of old, or the technology temples, or whatever we used to call them. They'll look like warehouses and distribution centers.
So data centers will really become more temporal and mobile in a way, and be able to connect to the cloud and unconnect.
The thing too is portable. If you look at it in a lot of respects, that you look at storage. Go back, I remember buying a 9-gigabyte hard drive back in '97. The thing was huge. It would took a lot of, basically it would rattle and shake when you go through. You look at today, the storage, you get a terabyte drive, a small fraction. That trend is going to continue. There's new innovations that are coming out of HP Labs as well that really will fundamentally shift the way that items are stored in memory, reducing storage, reducing the amount of RPMs that are sitting through and storing with data. And then in general, just the data centers, that whole perspective where you look at computing at one point, everything being put in one centralized location. What about distributed computing? So you look at a cloud, but a cloud of information where you may need to have one holistic view of data, which is really essentially your input, whereas the data can live in multiple different locations in multiple different areas. What ties that together is analytics. What ties it together is information access and other parts around that. You end up with a whole different paradigm. At some point, I could see people literally toting a data center essentially with a laptop. Think about a terabyte drive in a laptop. That was a rack years ago at this point, the amount of content that's in there. It brings together a whole new problem. Data doesn't die. It stays there forever. So what are you going to do at this point as far as pruning it? The amount of risk, the amount of benefit, the amount of reward that's inside there. Business information, as more and more of it gets created, the majority of it's unstructured and certainly poses information risk in a lot of cases at this time as well. Certainly approaches in dealing with those particular data sets are really going to become key in a data center, that you look at as an infrastructure component where originally you put a pod, you put servers, you put some CPUs in. What about the application at the data layer? Certainly can see areas around that where there'll be a lot of change coming in, beyond physically the I/O of the drive, but also the way in which we ask for data, and the way in which we save and write data in these data centers.
Excellent, gentlemen. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And then just a quick point I have. So I got asked a question today which said, so if we're going to rely on the cloud, what happens when the cloud goes down? And ultimately, the cloud is then made up of networks, data centers, application services, business services, and so on. So building these services is going to be important to understand the complete supply chain of who provides the business services. And you will need transparency of who's involved in the delivery of the business service. Because service providers will outsource to service providers who will outsource to service providers. And sometimes it's going to be difficult to understand where that chain ends. Ultimately, though, this is not science fiction, it's science fact. It will end up on servers in data centers somewhere. Architecting, though, resiliency in the service so that, as Brian described it, you can't really lose the data because it's actually distributed in so many places that even if there was failure, you could reconstitute it. It's going to become the norm. Added to that, just the density improvements you're going to see. I actually think, though, the volume of data will grow faster than our ability to store it. And so archiving policy, deciding what's actually critical to be kept versus what can be discarded will still be a key factor over the next few years.
But also, I think you're going to see a different set of devices generating that data than what you would consider today. You know, it won't be, you know, PCs and stuff. It'll be the building management systems, the cars, the buildings themselves, because the cost of sensors are going down, and you know the benefits of automation are going up. And you know, one of the things Dr. Stan Williams, one of the HP senior fellows, has come up is the central nervous system of the Earth, where everything basically becomes a sensor. There's trillions of sensors, and in order to get that data and make it valuable, you need the equivalent capacity of 10 of the current internets to carry all that load, and then it'll bury us in data if we're not careful.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, we have a couple of questions that have come in from our listeners. If I can address those to you.
Go ahead.
Perfect. The first is from Nora Barreto, and the question is, what would be the tips or tools to understand what people want to do and or understand their context? And I think, Brian, that is probably mostly aimed at your discussion around understanding context data analysis.
Sure. So yeah, there's definitely, it was a fundamental problem to crack at autonomy. We were acquired by HP back about 7 months ago, and our primary focus at autonomy was dealing with unstructured data, making sense of it, and determining it. The primary tools that we used to devise that was a mathematical approach to digesting and understanding data. Shannon information theorem, looking at entropy in data, understanding the randomness and looking for that. Also a Bayesian statistical model, looking at how items are predictors based on where it appears in the stream. So if you look at a stream of text, you can look at words that precede it. Like if I were to say I took my log for a walk, there's enough clues in that context to realize that it's probably a mistype of dog. What if I add another document that precedes it talking about a mental institution? Well, it might have a whole other context there at that point. So it really comes into the whole perspective of a series of content and dealing with data in streams. We can fundamentally look at and understand what the context is around that. What we're seeing today with mobile device proliferation, if you look at it, what's astonishing is in the developing world, in North America, in Europe, the amount of mobile devices I've got to probably have a third one at this point, an iPad, an iPhone, and at one point my wife has one as well. I had a BlackBerry at one point. Those devices are sensors as well, providing more context. So the more richness that gets put in this case, goes in. Now, the interesting part around it is our fundamental approach in research was not to hardwire particular items. You run out of scalability at that point. You can put in programmatically words in a program if this particular person is here at this particular point, if radius equals 50 and that particular item, you can then project. You can project a particular item. Where that fails is, suppose I'm watching a TV show, and I want to put a targeted advertisement in based on what people are watching. The problem I run into is someone watching the show because they like the Kentucky Derby, or they're watching the show because they come from Kentucky and they want to see what's going on. Very different paradigms, very different reasons as to why somebody would be behaving and watching a particular item. And that's where we look at it from understanding data, the tool sets that we use. It has to be, we had to do something different to deal with the shades of gray. We took a mathematical approach to fundamentally understand the stream of data.
Brian, would it be fair to say, or would it be a gross oversimplification to say that then one of the key tools to understanding context is understanding the metadata that goes around data creation and data requests.
So interesting, our whole philosophy is anti-metadata. So autonomy, our whole way, we believe metadata is obsolete. And librarians and I love to get in arguments about this all day about metadata. We based actually back at AIM in the early inception of the company, we wore pins around a circle and a slash, no metadata. We kind of softened our stance a little bit because we can learn from it. The problem in metadata is it's temporal. It's very temporal at the time of putting something into content. So if I were to take a particular piece of content and say, for example, well, this particular piece has to deal with Ontario and literally watching tourist activity, and particularly in Ontario, well, that's great. I tagged it at that point. What if that particular piece of information becomes relevant in an investigation about a tourist who tripped on a sidewalk or other items like that? Metadata didn't capture that because the future use of that data can't be predicted, can't be used at that point. So we look at it where as data evolves over time, the use of that data would have very different usages at this point, and therefore we needed a different approach to do it. So in metadata, we can certainly glue from it, but the reality as we see it at autonomy is it's a very different approach in making certain that content is continuously evolving and that we understand it from that point.
Thank you very much, Brian. We have another question from the audience here, and I think this is with relation to our discussion around data centers. The question is, with the consensus being that the amount of data stored in data centers will go up exponentially, is it the panel's opinion that magnetic drives will still have a place in 5 to 10 years' time, or will we have moved to SSDs?
That's a great question. I think you'll see a couple things. I think at the low end, because of the price points, you'll still see spinning stuff probably for another 5, 10 plus years. But I think it'll gradually go away. And then what's coming out in labs right now is what's called the memristor, which is 20 years ago was posited as a missing component, like in the, there's the capacitor, the resistor, the inductor, and this Berkeley professor said there should be one more in here because there's a hole. And Stan Williams' lab found it probably 5 years ago. Yeah, about 5 years ago. When they were trying to make something else, they accidentally made a memristor. And this is, right now in what is called the lab to fab stage. Should be commercially available in 2015 at the publicly announced date, and it will replace flash drives, and flash type memory has much higher speeds and also longer, much better cycles on it than flash does. So the memristor, I think, will be one of those revolutionary things that would drive the demise of the spinning media, just because of price points, stability. It will completely change. When you boot up your laptop, you hit the on switch and it will come on because it will remember where it was last time because it retains the state without the power. So I think that that's one of the key drivers that will change not only storage but also it'll change fundamental electric design because of the characteristics of the memristor. What do you think, Suki?
I agree. I mean, while we do see SSD coming into system design, it's really around the caching. It's still at a price point that won't replace the Mac drive. Tape, probably our server storage network guys would mind me saying this, but tape still has life, right, as a media format. Ultimately, though, I do see this shift moving to memristor-type drives where, based on the capacity we need, the performance, the energy considerations, it's all driving us to have to innovate in this space and look at alternative means. Yep.
Great answers. Yeah, I'm always wondering about tape myself because I'd sure love to see it go away.
Well, it's interesting. So this is Steve, and from an industry perspective, tape is an interesting subject in spinning disk. There are several examples in the entertainment industry of studios actually losing an entire movie. Pixar actually when they were starting to work on Toy Story 2, they went to restore the tapes from Toy Story 1 so they could actually pull those old models off. But the problem they found was, A, the tapes were not, they couldn't really read everything, number one. Number two, even what they were able to read, the OS was different, the software was a different version, so nothing was even backwards compatible. So they literally, on Toy Story 2, started from scratch on all the models and to do it. So the film industry at this point, the movie industry at this point, still prints physical negatives on acetate film because they're so nervous that if the data goes away, they lose it. When I ran restoration at the Walt Disney Company, we did restoration on a 70-year-old piece of film stock for Bambi. If that had been data on some ancient format, we probably wouldn't have been able to find that. But the fact that you have a physical manifestation of that media made that possible. So I think the bigger challenge, as we talk about storage and tape, is really from a long time archival perspective. How do you protect data out to 100 years? And I think that's the biggest challenge in the industry right now.
So Brian, does that mean we need to take all the 85% of unstructured data and make books?
The big question is the value of what's inside there. You could do it, and it's an interesting case with the ballooning set of content. Part of the problem is you have that 85%, and today they quote the internet at 0.5 zettabytes. I'd have to figure out what zetta is in the Latin world to see exactly how many zeros. It's a lot of zeros. 2035, we're looking at having 30-plus zettabytes of data. So the amount of content that's being created by the ability for us to even understand that is huge. So what is archival quality versus non-archival quality? That's really what is something that's worth archiving versus not. What's my opinion of it being archived versus not? These are certainly questions to ponder, and it really comes down to somebody who would perceive the value in it and have the ability to archive.
What's amazing to me is I think about the amount of data that's being generated, and I think about the amount of data that's almost identical across the world. So if 500,000 people travel to Rome and photograph the Pantheon, they take the same picture. They upload it to a cloud service. You have hundreds of thousands of pictures of the same exact thing. If a lot of the cloud services like Amazon, you can now upload your library to it, and they'll actually sort of do a deduplication of data across your music library. So I think there's an interesting kind of notion of sort of a global deduplication of data that's almost necessary to keep the amount of data we're generating down to a sort of reasonable amount.
At the same time, you hear things like Amazon has been recording every click since they went into inception. They don't quite know what they're going to do with it, but it might have value. So if you weren't recording it, you would never be able to derive the value. So some of this, I think, in the current space, I see in enterprises, they don't really delete anything.
Yeah.
Right? They just keep everything. So deduplication is at least playing a role right now around trying to simplify the many copies of things that exist.
Digital landfill, as it is in a lot of cases, where storing the content, there's been a lot of approaches where let's tag it, let's save it. Never really happens. It's easy to save stuff in an inbox or on a hard drive or in a particular area. Yeah. Actually creates another issue for enterprises, and that this data is scattered all over the place, not actually stored, not actually controlled. And we see a lot of high-profile cases where content is lying around in locations. It could be a detriment in a lot of cases. You may legally be able to dispose of content but not know about it until a particular period of time, but either subpoena gone through at that point. So that's an area where I was with general counsel for a very large international company. We did a demonstration of their content, stored it, indexed it, came back with things that said, well, here's an issue of we actually had to stop the meeting. We looked at it and saw that there were some particular patterns that didn't match up with what people were talking about. People talking about how many grapefruits their kids were buying in bands, that sort of thing. Didn't really jive right. So through further investigation, it turns into the particular fraud or insider information being sent out the walls of an organization. It's a lot of data pieces, and that's really where on many fronts. One of the financial services we deal with that is talking at the top of mind is the complexity in the war with data. getting access to it, working with it. And as far as person, your wealth at one point might have been a bag of gold that you have today. It's how many rows and columns in particular two sorts of databases out there. That whole shift that's happened, it really comes down to the value of storing it, but also understanding and really getting rid of it at particular parts. So one prime example we looked at with investigating Enron is, so we challenged them, took their data, scanned it in, and we came back with exotic bird names saying, well, did you realize that with the investigators, things such as falcon, peregrine, and other items, do you realize the meaning? I said, well, birds, no. Offshore companies, profits are being called. Once again, it's a case of dealing with data sets and understanding the nature above and beyond what the language is written. It becomes a very powerful thing in large data sets inside of organizations as it grows. So we see that growing. And storage, not so much a limiting factor. At one point that was. Now the limiting factor is managing it, understanding it, and keeping the risk, yet at the same time unlocking the value inside it.
Well, you go look at, the cost of data. Well, the whole, you look back, what's the causality of the Y2K thing we had? Well, the cost of a megabyte of disk storage back in 1970, 1980 was in, $500,000 to $1 million. What's the cost of a megabyte today? Fractions of a penny. But we had to spend a lot of time, and the cost of storage, has just been almost like a straight shot down a very straight slope because just the cost has gone down. And people, the cost of going through and trying to find the data you don't need anymore exceeds the cost of keeping it. And so it's just a, time, resources, money, it's easier to keep it than it is to figure out what you can throw away.
Yeah, and again, another industry example, when movies are shot on film is fairly expensive. So when the director yelled cut, they stopped the film rolling. And with digital now, because digital is considered to be sort of free, when the director yells cut, they just leave the camera rolling. And they keep recording megabytes and megabytes of data. And they'll tend to now shoot dozens of takes versus 2 or 3. So not only do you have more data just because of digital, but you've got sort of an acceptance. And I think we all do it with our digital cameras. When you put a roll of film in there, you're a little bit more careful about the photos you were taking because it costs money to print that piece of film and get prints from it. But when you have digital, you can take 20 shots of the same thing just to make sure you have the right shot.
So that leads me to another question that I have here, and I want to go actually right back to the beginning, Suki, where you were talking about the balance that we need to walk between operations and innovation, and primarily around the system of engagement being different in the workplace as opposed to outside the workplace, and the expectation that folks have that they want to see the same interface at home and at work. How do we balance that demand with the legislated need for privacy, particularly in public sector organizations?
So today, the paradigm is that in the social media and the public domain, you don't get a choice about how your data is used. You can say it's your data, but you don't have any control on how that data is being used. And Facebook is a classic example here, right? The only way of stopping Facebook using your data is to delete your account. We feel that when you look at that Facebook model and compare that to the fact that Amazon knows what you're buying, Google knows what you're searching, LinkedIn knows who you work with, all of these are non-opt-out models. We need to move to a model where the personal preferences, your personalization, what you like, what you feel you might want to share, should be abstracted out somehow into a cloud profile. So this is a little theoretical, futuristic, but imagine somebody, I'm not saying government, but let's just pick financial industry. They know a lot about what I spend, they know a lot about my savings. Maybe I might trust them to hold my profile. And maybe it's a federation of profile providers. But this provider would maintain this profile for me, and then I would be able to choose who I want to share that with. And it could be down to the next half hour for the next 10 minutes. And that would be shared then with service providers who would give me something in return. So let me give you an analogy. I worked on a defense contract around 2001, so 11 years ago. And I was quite surprised that I was working with people who didn't have credit cards. And the reason they said they didn't have credit cards wasn't because they couldn't get one. It's that they didn't want Visa or American Express to know what they were purchasing. So there was this resistance to, I'm not letting anybody know what I have. Now, ultimately, a lot of those people, Phil Campbell, my friend, did actually get credit cards. Why? Because life was just so much easier with a credit card, right? You didn't have to keep going to an ATM, getting out cash, etc. So again, today I don't have a choice on who uses my personalization, my profile to give me services. But let's say I could. And let's say I was willing to opt in occasionally because it made my life easier. Because if I was in a mall, and I personally don't like going shopping. I go to buy things. I don't go to shop. But if I was in a shopping mall and my location information, which I feel is my information, my preferences, which again I feel is my information, maybe I might want to share those to several service providers in a mall who in turn would give me offers that are very relevant to me. But if that falls into the trap of the advertising model, then I would just opt out straight away. Because the last thing I want to do is walk down an avenue of shops with my phone beeping every 30 seconds, making Groupon-type offers to me of things I might not be interested in. So this has got to get to a level of fidelity and context about who I am, what I like, and have an option of opting in. Now, you started with that concern around enterprise versus personal. What if I actually had multiple profiles? What if I actually had a work profile as well as a personal profile? And that I actually kept my work profile separate from my employer. So now I'm really jumping ahead here, right? And that actually, every time I moved employer, the profile was shared about what my interests were, my communities of interest, my specialism, the kind of people. And as soon as I connect to an employer, be because I'm a casual employee, so I contract, let's say, for 3 months at a time, I can get quickly integrated into an enterprise where they would be able to consume that and say, oh, this person just arrived, here's the knowledge and skills he brings to our enterprise, and this is how we might be effectively able to use it. If you lock that into every system you connect to, then there's no mobility. So I feel there's a little abstraction of that, and I think some of the services will be able to consume that in the future. So that's just a little thing way out there, but I see that as a natural evolution of what we're going to have to go through.
Do you see, Suki, that the workplace will completely evolve to the point where, you know, the large enterprise really doesn't exist much anymore, that it's really a collection of temporary groups that get built from using that profile?
So we coined this as a dynamic enterprise. So I absolutely feel we'll be moved to a dynamic enterprise. I think there will be a core. There will be a small inner core of this is the core of our business. But there will be an ecosystem of partners, of suppliers, of a supply chain, and that will be much more dynamic. And you will engage with those partners for effect. And if you're not getting the effect, you will quickly change and move to a different partnering model or an ecosystem, and that will be much more dynamic. Just like I want it to be dynamic for the person, I think it'll be dynamic for the enterprise.
And in the entertainment industry, we already see that. So in a very heavy effects-laden movie like an Avatar, there are over 100 companies that were involved in the creation of that movie. And a lot of those companies were literally started and shut down in a week. And they're built up of contractors who contributed components, or they did one shot or just did one aspect. They just did wire removal for one character. So you have these kind of virtual studios that pop up and go away almost instantly. And that kind of sort of mercenary dynamic is already happening in film production industry.
And crowdsourcing is another sort of dimension.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's really interesting, gentlemen. I wonder how far away that actually is. Suki, you're indicating that dynamic, well, the work versus personal profiles, cloud profile, and federated identification is a future, but and then we start talking about dynamic enterprise concept, and Stephen, as you said, it's existing today, and particularly in the media. Digital media and communications world. I would look to even the concepts of open source software, crowdsourcing, and all the different types of collaboration that go on, and the need for what we'll call them collaboration technologies such as video conferencing, groupware, things like that. It seems that we're really on the cusp.
I agree. I think there are several technologies that are here available now. What I feel, though, is there's a shift that is not so much in the technology domain, but in the business model domain that is lagging behind to accommodate some of these technology advantages and bring them to market and mainstream much more quickly.
We'll also see if that's going to actually have another impact. I'm looking out the window here at the office buildings in Toronto, and if I can mobilize my workers, there's a big push to this in the U.S. public sector, and federal government is, do I really need all these big buildings to house my enterprise, or can I put my workers close to the client and not have to build the buildings or occupy that? So, a lot of the savings, there'll be a lot of real estate savings and impact from not having to house the workers close, because you have the collaboration tools and the controls to go with it to get the work done.
Ed, do you think that socially our society is ready for that kind of a shift?
We're living it every day in HP. I work out of Plano, Texas. My closest teammate is in Tulsa, 3 hours drive away. My boss is in D.C. So I guess I'm living that dream right now. But I still think that it's important, to come in and see people and collaborate, because the quality of the interaction, even in a Halo room, is not quite there yet. There's things you can do, over lunch and stuff that you can't do, remotely.
Yeah. So, there's some work that is going on in the Middle East in carbon neutral cities. Yeah, and so Mazda City is an example here. And one of the sort of prototypes that we saw early on was this, the carbon footprint of an individual. And the significant part of that carbon footprint is actually going to and from work. And so there was a concept which was that imagine a room in your house which looked like a room most of the evening and morning, but at some point all of the walls were actually IP painted and could become a cube in an actual office. So a flick of a switch, you actually walked into the office and it felt as though you just walked into a cube in an office, and you could actually stand up and see the other people in the cube and shout to them, and they would wave back at you, and they could have a conversation. Now, they couldn't walk into your cube, but you could get that kind of experience. Now, somewhere out there, but in terms of the amount of energy consumed, expended in people moving around for just meetings is significant. Now, I actually feel there's a balance that has to be struck here. You can't do everything in a virtual world, but do any of us remember Second Life, right? Where did that go, right? Although I do see a little resurgence in those kind of capabilities. Getting 25 people on a conference call and trying to mediate a facilitated collaboration is just impossible, right? Especially a bunch of senior technologists, right? Who are all opinionated about their views. Yeah. So even trying to do that then on a video conference doesn't work. But in a sort of facilitated collaboration zone where you can actually turn off all their mics and say, actually, at this point, you will all listen to me. Or actually, this is now an interactive part of the workshop. All go onto the board and put your yellow stickies on the board of what your idea is, and then we'll collaboration in virtual world. Not perfect, but those kind of capabilities are emerging, and some of that is open source code that's available today.
Fantastic. I'm sorry to say that we're at the end of our time for today. I've really enjoyed the conversation. So thank each of you, gentlemen, Suki, Ed, Stephen, and Brian, for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was really interesting to sort of collaborate and share on this thing. So thank you.
Excellent. And for everyone who's attended real time and for those who will listen to this recording later, thank you very much for joining us today for Innovation with the Innovators. We hope you found the event of value. Today's webinar recording will be posted on the British Columbia chapter page on the Vivid website along with all the Q&A. If you're interested in hearing more from these HP pioneers and other visionary technology leaders, please join us in Vancouver this Thursday, May 31st for the HP Game Changers Half-Day Technology Symposium, or in Las Vegas, June 5th to 7th for the annual HP Discover Conference. For more information on these events or to listen to this recorded webinar at a later date, please join the online conversation and become a member for free at www.vivid-worldwide.org, where your free Vivid Worldwide membership entitles you to collaborate with the best and the brightest technologists using HP software. Thank you very much.